Okay, so everyone's here and we can start. And I'm really happy that so many of you decided to join us also for the second part. We aimed at the second part of our conference for international audience. That's why we're also recording it and live streaming because we hope that this will be useful not just for organizations from countries that just had elections, but also for representatives of those countries that are yet to have general elections during the next year and maybe in 2020 as well. And I'm really happy that we have several representatives from Lithuania, Estonia, and Ukraine here with us. And we also hope that following this conference and this event, we will send the live recording of the success stories that are going to be presented right now, also to countries in Balkan region, maybe in, elsewhere in Europe as well. And my colleague Liga Stafetska is also going to prepare a guidance for organizations in different regions on what can be learned from experience of those countries that have recently held elections. So we really aimed when organizing this conference for international scope and as you can see, looking at dear panelists here in front, that we have managed to achieve it. We have four distinguished guests who are almost all of them are practitioners regarding election integrity. Gunta Sloga does not need any introduction anymore. We met her already this morning. She's Gunta. Gunta is director of Baltic Center for Media Excellence, on a leave right now, but not for long. And she's the person who was mainly in charge of coordinating different civil society organizations in Latvia before these elections. We also have with us Peter Nyhlin from Civil Contingency Agency in Sweden. They had their elections in September and still they are looking forward to forming a new government, which is a story we know very well here in Latvia because we have the same problem. And Sweden was one of those countries that prepared the most before elections on possible foreign interference. That's why Peter, we're really glad that you are with us. Liz Carolan from Transparent Referendum Initiative in Ireland. I met Liz in Paris during Paris Peace Forum, where Liz introduced herself, and it turned out that there was a very similar kind of activities happening during Irish referendum and here in Latvia during our elections. And Liz has some stories to share regarding her cooperation with Facebook and Google that are quite similar to what Inga already told us in context of Latvia. But maybe my impression is that maybe more inspiring ones, but I don't know yet whether those will really be more inspiring ones. And last but not least, we have Martin Florack, which is a political expert in Germany. From what I understand, also quite well known and comments to media on topics related to elections. And we really hope that you, Martin, would be able to give us some broad introduction on what went on during elections in Germany a bit more than a year ago. It was quite a long time. It's quite a long time for the current speed of events, but nevertheless, I think we would benefit greatly if we also knew what went on in Germany. So these are our panelists, and the plan is as follows. I will talk with each panelist successively. We'll start with most recent elections, most recent event in Latvia with Gunta. We will try to not exceed 20 minutes in Gunta sharing her main talking points and me asking her questions, and also I will try to also let you as an audience also to participate, and then we will move to a case of Sweden, then to Ireland, then we will finish this event with Germany. So we are going in a reverse chronological alphabetical order. So that's the plan. And let's start right now with you, Gunta. It would be excellent if you could very briefly tell to a broader audience, not just in Latvia, of what would you consider to be a success story in Latvia in ensuring election integrity before 2018 parliamentary elections.
Of course, I can talk about media and NGO from angle of media and NGO experience. I cannot talk like what was the success of government or whoever else. And I should say that in springtime, there were a lot of media people, NGO people, also some people who were responsible for coordination of safe elections, who were just like walking around and saying we should be better prepared because nobody knows what to expect. Of course, we live together with this big neighbor and we have experienced its propaganda for many years, and it may be possible that we are threatened. So, and that's why the main purpose of our initiatives was coordination and coming together and just being prepared to all the possible threats to media and information space. And I would say that, of course, maybe as the first panel already said, that maybe there were not so many cases of intruding into election process, but also I think it was very important that media and NGOs were well prepared and we helped them. Do you want me to tell how?
I think it would be great if you could enumerate some of activities that all our organizations did before elections.
Yes. At first, it was really, sometimes, you know, there are those NGOs and media who like work on everyday basis, like Providus, yourself, or Transparency International organization DALNA, or Baltic Center for Investigative Journalism Baltica, or the DFRL Lab, which was Atlantic Council, a branch for spotting some fake news and other disinformation cases on internet platforms, and really coming together and coordinating our efforts, just knowing what each other does. Are there any possibilities to do something together? And then for us as a center, the main objective, of course, was working with media. And what do I mean working with media? At first, we always stress that media don't take any part in any propaganda war or whatever. The main aim of media is do properly the jobs they do every day. And but what did we do? We understood that we have to make media more resilient and more aware of possible threats. And that's why we had cooperation with NATO Stratcom, who created a series of possible scenarios what could go wrong. Starting from hacking media, starting from hacking like, for example, Central Election Commission webpage and what media then do, or some other disinformation cases. And then the big thing was to get together all the media, because media landscape in Latvia is very fragmented, and on everyday basis media usually don't cooperate a lot or even don't come together. And then like just get those media together and go through those scenarios. But it was not the end of the project. Also, we understood that there is this other part which is very important on the road to safe elections, and these are all government institutions and security services. So at the beginning it sounded insane, because people told me that like it will never happen, that both those sides will be sitting around one big table. But at the end we managed this, and we had a series of seminars and discussions where we went through those scenarios. And it really helped, because at the beginning, when we had this big event with all the government representatives and security service representatives sitting together with with editors in chief of all big national media and discussing those possible scenarios and what everybody could do. And you could see that there were a lot of missing links on both sides. For example, public broadcaster not being aware that they could be hacked, or those government institutions still not being prepared for a proper coordination of some big crisis. And then in 2 months' time, you could see that there was this last meeting before elections, and you see that there have been some preparations on media side, and also a much more better coordinated work on institutions and security services side. And it was just sometimes those strange things, how but when it comes to security of your country, say safeguarding your elections, then you come together and you understand that you are not fighting sides. Of course, it was very always stressed that it's not that nobody interferes in any other's business. It's more really coordination. And also, of course, what we did a lot of seminars in this 2 months period, especially when it comes to regional media, because of course national media, they are tech savvy, they know everything, but when it comes to regional media, we also did a lot of maybe very simple seminars on fake news and spotting some hidden contents, and also going with those representatives of government institutions to those regional media. So it was this big scale event, and I would say that it was, when you look back, you understand that it was not only about elections, it was really how you make media aware of all those threats they are facing actually on everyday basis.
Okay, thank you, Gunta. And before I open the floor for questions to Gunta, if there are any, I just wanted to add that civil society in Latvia were really well prepared before elections. What Inga told during the first panel on catching different kinds of advertisements on Facebook and combining that with efforts from Baltic Media Excellence Center and the projects that we did together to look at whether people receive some suspicious materials in their mailboxes, or whether opinion polls are not totally faked. So for Latvian civil society, I think this was an unprecedented mobilization and coordination of different efforts in order to protect our elections. If you have any questions to Gunta or any comment, we have time to address them. Yes.
Hi, my name is Andris Melakaus. I'm from the Ministry of Culture. One thing that surprised me in the latest elections, there was no major attempt to influence the elections on, I'll say it openly, on Russian channels that are based in other countries like the UK. I think it was 2011 when 2 channels actually had political advertising during just before the referendum on Russian as a state language, and the UK regulator actually found that they were guilty of this political advertising, but it took them almost a year to come to this decision. Maybe I missed it, but was there any attempt on the foreign channels to influence our election?
Not directly. As we already were discussing, as the first part of this event, there was, this usual way of broadcasting. Those channels usually they sympathize with Saskaņas centers, this pro-Russian party or so on, but it wasn't that. This was the case that actually there were no big influences on media.
But would you say, Gunta, would you agree to Mr. Jānis Sārts during the first panel today, who said that we don't really know what would have happened if not for those preparatory works that were conducted both by civil society organizations and by governmental organizations here in Latvia? Would you say that such kind of effort would be justified in the future, or the lack of foreign interference during these elections indicate that maybe we exaggerated the threat?
You know, I don't have one answer. From one side, you know, we are always like living with this big neighbor, and we are always, you know, like a bit afraid that he will do something to us. But then again, I think all those efforts which have been done, it's not about elections. It's really about like how do we live everyday life, and like that public service broadcaster is now like. They have prepared all the platforms so they cannot be hacked. Actually, it's not only about elections, you know. It's all, of course, only one example, but there are many other measures which have been taken, and I think that it was still very important that we do those preparations. And we don't know, because we see from country to country that those ways to interfere, they are changing and technologies are changing, and you don't know what to expect next. But everything you can do, you should do, definitely. I think it was worth of those efforts.
Okay, thanks a lot, Gunta. Let's move to Peter in Sweden, who did even more than Latvia, if I understand correctly, but mainly from the side of governmental institutions. I will switch on your presentation shortly, but do I understand correctly that basically it was the state institutions who secured elections in Sweden, or is it a mistake to think like that?
I guess I would like to talk about all society's approach in that way, and the ambition was to make sure that everyone was aware of certain threats. But obviously we can do our part from an agency like the one I'm working in. And just to explain where I work and what my agency do, brief sketch of the Swedish crisis management system. And you have to imagine they planned the system in the 50s when they were very afraid of nuclear war. So it was very important that the local level it's very decentralized. And the local level doesn't really need us at the national level. And if I ever try to direct or give an order to someone at the local level, they would laugh at me, because that's not how our system works. What the regional level and the national level can do is to support and coordinate, and that's very important. So from my perspective, what we can do at the national level is to support and coordinate, but you have tens of thousands of people at the local level that has to do the job and to solve problems. So that's the short brief. At the national level, the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency has a coordinating role when it comes to any kind of emergency. So if it threatens our environment or our health or our democracy, whatever the threat, we have the coordinating role. And that's my job, to try to coordinate. We can also create a situational operational picture. We can try to gather knowledge from abroad, and then we can try to share it with all the relevant stakeholders. And that was the main task in the project and in the task force that we worked within to protect our election. The starting point was that our election system, thanks God, is not digitalized. It's a manual, very old school system. Like a lot of other things, it's decentralized. It's extremely transparent, which is a risk in itself. But you can actually follow the votes as a citizen. You can watch everything. It's totally transparent. Obviously, elections in more powerful nations have been attacked recently, and to us, the US presidential election 2016 was an alarm. And the attitude was that we are going to assume that our election will be interfered, and we are not taking any chances. And the thing is, the goals to our national security, democracy, human rights, if it's threatened from abroad, then that's a threat to our national security. So it will be prioritized. So it hasn't been any problem to motivate, because most parts in our system has been very motivated. And when we looked on other elections, we tried to find some kind of pattern in what have been targeted in other elections. And undermining trust in the election process, well, our election is vulnerable. Influence the will and ability of voters. You know, you can undermine the will to vote, disinformation about voting procedures. And obviously influence the political preferences of voters. Well, an election isn't a festival in trying to influence each other, but obviously everyone has to be aware of that social media can be manipulated in a million ways. And obviously, you always have the risk of subversion of political candidates and parties. And that's more a job for the security service and the police to handle. And also the top politicians have to be aware about these risks and the candidates. So that's how we sliced the sausage when we set to work. And obviously raising awareness in different arenas in our society. The election process, well, tens of thousands of people are involved in counting the votes, and they are obviously a very important target group. They have to be aware of risks. Well, I haven't talked so much about the kind of system we had to try to get incident reports up to the national level, but we wanted everyone working in the municipality level to be able to report if they had a hunch, if they saw something fishy going on, because it's difficult to know exactly what to look for. But we cannot see a coherent long-term influence campaign similar to that happening in some other countries. We haven't seen an infrastructure. We have seen incidents. We have seen a lot of noise from domestic groups, but we haven't seen any big pressure towards our election from abroad. On the other hand, we are worried that there are continuous information influence activities targeting the reputation of our country. And it deals with, we're not a NATO member. Migration issues, obviously. I kind of like the fact, as a Swede, I am grown up to believe that we are very, very boring, but according to this, we are very decadent. So I don't mind, but and there's a lot of rumors. Some state-controlled outlets, there's a lot of talk about no-go zone areas, and I happen to live in one of those suburbs, so we kind of laugh about that. We received 160,000 asylum seekers back in 2015, but our economy has created 300,000 new jobs, and our crime rate is going down. So we're doing pretty well, but not according to some state-controlled outlets abroad. So that's a problem for us. But when it comes to the election, no, we didn't see any severe infrastructure. Maybe I pressed the wrong button there. I don't know.
Okay, so we will probably ask somebody from technical side, but basically you should... Oh, okay, here it is. Okay.
That was it. I have some recommendations, but those are the obvious ones, I guess. It was interesting the week after the election, it was some drama because it turned out that the result was very, very even, and it was a lot of drama. And it was a lot of drama around the difference between the preliminary results and the final results. And it takes about a week between the preliminary results and the final. And it wasn't really the same results. So and we didn't underestimate, we expected it, but it's a very strong force to amplify every slight mistake and every slight misunderstanding in how the election system actually works. And the election system is complicated. It's very difficult to explain exactly how the mathematics of it all works. And we had target groups that were very interested in misunderstanding. So to be very transparent and relevant about how the election system works with all the web pages and all the information before the election, that was important because we have groups in the society that have a very low trust in the system. So that's one of them. But obviously to me, coordination is totally vital to our system. We cannot give orders or direct. Everything is based on the ability to coordinate efforts. So to us, that's the key recommendation within our system.
Okay, thanks so much, Peter. How confident, a question from me before I turn to audience, how confident were you before elections that if something strange happens, for example, on social media, as was discussed during the first panel, I don't know, lots of Facebook advertising or some strange joke pages turning into something more political, that you would have been able to identify that? Do you think that you were prepared for such eventualities?
Yes. Well, the ambition was clear that we wanted to detect while it was happening. We didn't want to wait for investigations that can go on for years to understand what was happening. We wanted to see what was happening while it was happening. So the coordination of it was all the way to the intelligence sector, and we wanted every communicator in every municipality to be very pay attention.
To be very vigilant.
Yes.
Okay, but during our first panel, in case of Latvia, we heard different opinions in governmental sector and in journalistic organizations, whether cooperation with large social networks was or was not successful. In your case of Sweden, would you say that large social networks such as Google and Facebook were forthcoming and helpful and reacted in appropriate time frames, which in case of elections means almost immediately?
I can say that they were serious they were ambitious. We had a lot of meetings with Facebook and Google and Twitter, and from my perspective, they are just like media outlets. They are an important and vital part of the infrastructure when it comes to information. So, yeah, and we had to know the points of contacts, and we had to be sure that we could talk to each other in a good way and in a good manner. And that was a little bit new thing because they have their integrity and they haven't been especially keen to talk to people like me before. No, I cannot say, like, I don't want to review them. I mean, the only thing I can say that it wasn't any problem to book any meetings with them, and they were very keen on talking about the kind of problems that they feel that they have and what they need to do to do their work better. But obviously we have to respect their integrity because we don't want to mess with whatever they do on their platforms. That's not our job.
Okay. Any questions, comments from the audience? Okay, Inga.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Last week I heard also a presentation by your colleague, Mikael Tovesson.
That's my boss.
Excellent. And I didn't ask him, that's why I wanted to ask you. He mentioned two interesting things in his presentation I wanted to clarify more. He said that at first you were teaching people, audience, how to you were monitoring, you saw what kind of messages are mostly like generated on social media, and you informed people, pay attention now to these topics. And be careful, maybe there is some misinformation. And then later you even didn't anymore ask people to pay attention to certain topics, but to emotions. If there is post which makes you, I don't know, it's my interpretation of how I understood, angry or somehow, then pay attention, maybe it's something kind of shady because social media algorithms show more emotional things. So that was, if you could tell something more about how did you identify and how did you tell it? And second thing, how did you distribute it to the people? Through which channels? How did you get out to the people that they really hear what you are saying? Because again, of social media specifics, how they are, working. Thank you.
Well, I think a couple of years ago, we were afraid of lies or facts that were completely wrong. But we haven't, when we monitor, it's very rare that people actually tell clear lies. It's more often that emotions are amplified and that narratives, the polarization, if I like a particular thing and my neighbor hates that thing, and that our polarization is amplified by different tricks in social media. And I guess that was the message when it came to emotions, that you have to be aware. If you get really, really angry, it might be someone that is interested in polarization and not interested in the issue in itself. So that was the message. There was a lot of attention about these risks this spring, for instance. So we didn't have from MSB's side, we didn't have a campaign towards the public, really. There was a lot of journalists that wrote about these issues and asked us a lot of questions. We didn't have a targeted communication campaign in those fields. But we have, this spring we had a campaign concerning total defense and civil defense issues, and psychological defense is a part of that. So that's one of the things we did this spring. And handling information and trying to understand information and the risks involved is a part of that message to the public, so to speak. Did I forget another question? Or
it was the question.
Getting it out was just through answering questions to media. It was pretty simple.
In case of Sweden, what we noticed in Latvia, that there's diminishing number of people who consume media. Have you noticed any similar pattern in Sweden, or no?
We still have quite high rate in our population that actually reads books. So we're very fond of that part of our population. We still have quite a lot of libraries, and for 20 years the big media, commercial media houses have been losing a lot of money, but the last years they've been struggling up again. So it's, I guess we have a landscape which is pretty well nourished compared to some other countries.
Okay. Any more questions? Then I still have one. You mentioned those those questions that divide population in Sweden, or that might be used to divide population. And my question to you is, let's take the most heated one, issue relating to migration. Have you managed to develop any way how to tell whether this debate during time before elections is pushed forward by only political forces and citizens living in Sweden, or there is some other influence as well? How easy is it to tell in case of Sweden?
It's very sensitive for me as a civil servant to say to a part of our population that you might be influenced by another country, that's a very, very sensitive topic, and it's very difficult to say that, but that's actually basically what we've said. Anyway.
And what reactions did you get?
Yeah, a certain group is not happy about that.
Okay.
So that's extremely difficult because we do our analysis, we draw conclusions, and if someone asks us what conclusions have you drawn, we could stamp it top secret and not say anything, but that wouldn't be legal. So that part of our analysis is an open analysis.
But is there any other controversy regarding the work that you did before elections in Sweden? I understand that some parties are maybe not extremely happy, but has there been any criticism, or everyone has agreed that this has been a useful process and needs to be continued?
It was sensitive to sit in meetings with the tech giants. Themselves, they are very careful about nations. I imagine that having a meeting in some countries, if you represent Facebook and you have a meeting in certain countries, their intelligence sector will eat you. So they have to be careful when they approach someone like me.
Okay.
But there was some controversy that we somehow could get the ability to censor stuff on social media, and especially censor criticism when it came to the migration question. In some groups, there was a lot of conspiracy theories that we had more power than we had. So, and that was a little bit controversial, but it was only a few articles. Okay. It wasn't massive.
Okay, I see. Thanks a lot, Peter. Okay, and now we move backwards, even more backwards in time to May this year, when a referendum on a also very sensitive issue relating to abortion was held in Nyhlin. And Liz is going to tell us about that. I will try to switch on your presentation. It's just very uncommon for people living in Latvia to know that one can try to also influence not just election campaign, but referendum campaign. How did you even consider a possibility that this is something that you might want to, or might need to monitor?
Yeah, well, so that was actually where I was going to start. So great question. I have some slides for that. Well, I think so. Back in May, Ireland held a referendum because we have had a constitutional ban on abortion in all circumstances since about 1983. A group of citizens who got together went through a process and decided that it was time to have a referendum to sort of look at whether or not that should continue. They decided to have a referendum, and that was going to take place in May of this year. Spoiler, people voted yes 2-1, and actually last night the legislation passed through Parliament, which is sort of enacting that. But back this time last year, it was all very uncertain, and it was around that time that I, as a massive nerd, was watching Senate hearings about where they were trying to dissect what had happened in the presidential election of 2016. And this image sort of sticks in my mind. This is like the US Senate, who compared to Ireland have so many resources and people and capacity, and they were looking at kind of photographs people had taken of laptop screens to try and figure out what had happened, and they were doing that a year after the election had taken place. And some of the context for the Irish referendum is 3 years before, Ireland had voted for same-sex marriage in a referendum by similar margin. And that became, it sort of used symbolically, I think, in a lot of countries, especially in the US, as a sign that, you know, if even Ireland, even little Catholic Ireland is making progress, then we need to too. But I mean, you know, likewise, you know, we saw that people who were against those same issues also saw Ireland's ban on abortion as quite important symbolically. So while we're only a couple of million people like Latvia making a decision, it mattered symbolically to a lot of people outside of the country. And we knew that there was kind of a broader kind of broader underlying issue that groups on both sides of the campaign, but particularly pro-life groups, were kind of had a lot of support from the US. A lot of pro-choice groups also did as well, and from foreign groups. So we knew that this was an area where strange things could happen, and so some friends and I decided, just as a volunteer project, to try and do something about one part of this question, which was sort of social media ads, and how could we make them more, at least more visible, how could we make them more transparent, so that they could be exposed to the same kind of scrutiny and fact-checking and source tracing as other content in the referendum. We also knew, and again, this is from both sides of the debate, that the question of abortion itself is one which is quite controversial, but also it's one where like facts and the idea of facts and evidence is also highly contested, highly debated, and the line between kind of fact and evidence and emotion is incredibly difficult to discern. And so while we have a referendum commission that normally looks into sort of claims that are made by some campaigns, for this vote they just sort of decided at the very beginning that they weren't going to do any of that, that they couldn't intervene, so there was going to be nobody sort of looking at the quality of the debate either. Another factor was that, so Ireland has quite strong values in our electoral law, so we ban TV advertising, we have strict limits on donations people can give. But this is just, the legislation just was written in the 1990s and doesn't know how to deal with the modern age. So for example, you could not donate if you were a foreign citizen, but you could spend as much money as you wanted if you were spending that directly. Because in 1990, if you were based in New York, it would be very difficult for you to make a direct expenditure to influence a referendum. But in 2018, it's actually incredibly easy, as we saw. So we teamed up with Who Targets Me, who are similar to the ProPublica tool that Inga mentioned this morning. It's a scraper tool. 600 volunteers downloaded it, and we were able to gather 1,500 ads related to the referendum in real time, so sort of as they were being posted. And my big plan, because I'm an open data nerd, was I'll just put these in a spreadsheet on the internet and magical things will happen and we'll have accountability and everything will happen. And so I had thought that this project would probably be a few hours of my time every week. It wasn't. It was about 14 hours a day for a few months. Because actually, you know, it was one thing sort of like doing the uncovering and finding out what was going on, but I think, as all the speakers have said, sort of getting from there to a point whereby citizens know what's going on, we have a full picture, we're able to dig into that information, takes a coordinated effort across a huge number of people. So I want to just talk a little bit about what we saw. So these are kind of like the smoking gun ads. So these are advertisements that were placed by groups who are registered overseas. They have addresses in London and Paris and New York on their Facebook pages, paying for advertising, telling people to vote one way or the other. So this is a UK-based organization, this is a Canadian organization, and this is an organization there based in the Bronx in New York. And so these were really, really kind of good concrete examples that we were able to sort of share with journalists. We ended up having a kind of a WhatsApp group with about 10 or 15 journalists on it who we could send these over to as they were coming through, to be able to just start to tell the story. And I think some of that question of how do we inform the public that some of the content that they're seeing online they need to be more questionable of. We were also able to share these with Facebook, who kind of got in touch with the regulator to try and see, well, what do we do with these? And in the end, Facebook eventually, after a lot of pressure, and actually only after these stories got into international news sites rather than just the little Irish ones. I think if you want to get Facebook to do something, get it in the New York Times. So they eventually unilaterally decided to ban overseas groups from placing ads, which was great. But beyond that, there was all sorts of other completely untraceable ads. So the classic Soros conspiracy, I don't know if that's a big deal up here. It actually wasn't really before this, and now suddenly I am a Soros plant and everything. I'm sure you all are. And so this is one. It was a website registered in a industrial estate in somewhere in Kansas or Arkansas or something, completely untraceable. It was timed to coincide with a fundraising drive that raised €500,000 in 1 week for the pro-choice campaign, the biggest fundraising ever. And this was saying, oh, it's all a lie, it's all a lie, it's all George Soros. We then had other. And I think it's similar to what Inga found, kind of pop-up pages, I was calling them. So they would just appear out of nowhere. They would just flood the place with advertising, with paid content that was like, kind of like, you know, I would consider this sort of junk news. You know, and as soon as we would sort of flag it or get a story written about it, it would vanish. So we caught a lot of these. But again, we were only seeing a tiny portion of the advertising that was happening, but we were able to get enough examples to get stories written that, you know, at a minimum, kind of like we hoped that the public were more informed about what was going on. I just want to, like, you know, this wasn't obviously the only way that the internet was being used, so we saw a lot of these. So these were fundraising drives in the US for people who wanted to campaign. Actually, this group ended up flying over to Ireland to hand out leaflets and do all sorts of things to keep Ireland pro-life. And then there was Google. And so these are actually ads that I personally saw while looking at news articles about Facebook and Google advertising that were political advertising. We got some figures last week from Google that before they took a sort of a step. There was about a 7-to-1 ratio in kind of official payments that were made to Google, so through them, so not through other kind of services that use them. But about a couple of weeks before the referendum, actually the day after Facebook decided to ban overseas groups, Google took the decision to remove the ability of anybody to place any political advertising temporarily between that point or the next day and the vote. So this enraged a lot of pro-life groups because I think their sort of entire strategy and plan with 1 day's notice was completely taken away from them. And you know, that's not what we were calling for. Like we just think there should be transparency around this. You should see where is the money coming from, who is paying for this content, who is being targeted. And that ended up being then another story and another narrative that was picked up hugely in the US right-wing press and is still being sort of used as part of the narrative of Google interfering in elections. But I mean, despite Google taking that unilateral sort of self-regulatory step, this was sent to me like the night before. So this is during the Google ad ban. So these weren't necessarily Google ads. But this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is 5 different ads from with 3 different types of branding. That was just, this is a person who was looking to buy a necklace online. And this is what the internet in Ireland looked like in the run-up to the referendum. Again, we have absolutely no idea who paid for these or where they came from, what the targeting was being like. And I said that this was during this was during the bans. And so our kind of way of working was, as I said, to sort of like try and sort of feed this stuff to journalists as we were seeing to get things written. So the Irish Times were great. They did quite a few stories, the Times of London. But as I said, it was sort of when we were able to get this story onto sort of some of the international news agendas. And right in the middle of this, the Cambridge Analytica story broke. So I was getting multiple phone calls a day from various journalists, and that kind of helped in a way. But this isn't really how we should be figuring out our domestic elections, is by trying to get the New York Times to write about something. And, you know, especially in small countries. And I concur with a lot of what the panel said this morning. Like, we need a Europe-wide solutions to this. We need to be thinking, I think, in particular around just some of that transparency and traceability. And I just want to talk a bit about, like, so how do we get from, so on the left is an ad that we saw and that we were able to sort of escalate, and on the right is a kind of short film that was on Channel 4 News. That's a British news channel that also broadcasts in Ireland. So some great reporting by Porrick Ryan. But this took weeks of work, and on-the-ground reporting and digging into who owns different websites and all sorts of things, in order to get from the point where we even have the transparency to the point whereby we're able to sort of tell a story. And this story coincidentally coincided with Facebook deciding to ban overseas advertising. And so, but then, of course, the question is like, okay, so once we do that, then what does the accountability, what does that look like? How do we make sure, I think it's not good enough that we have, like, because I'm watching Britain fall apart at the moment. One of the parts of that is they're still trying to figure out what happened in June of 2016 in that referendum and in that vote. And it's not good enough for us to be scraping. It's journalists who are digging this stuff up, and they're doing it when it's frankly too late to sort of to do anything about it. So that's me.
Okay, so thanks so much, Liz. Before I turn to audience, just a clarifying question. Did I understand correctly that Facebook prohibited during this referendum campaign advertising from abroad, and Google prohibited any kind of political issues-based advertising the day before the referendum?
So it was, I think, around the 10th of May, so it was maybe 2 weeks, or between 2 and 3 weeks before the referendum. Okay. So on a Tuesday, Facebook announced that they were withdrawing the ability of overseas groups to advertise. They said that that was because of ambiguity in the law. So they had asked for clarification about whether or not this violated election laws. Our regulators didn't know the answer. Because the law wasn't written for this question, and so they decided to ban overseas groups. I think that was imperfect. Like, there were journalists in the UK who were able to still place advertising, and we were contacted by groups, Irish groups, who were banned from advertising. So I mean, because it's like, I think that they're just not set up right. The systems haven't been designed, and they need to be designed to sort of deal with election integrity questions. Google the next day then banned or blocked anybody from doing political advertising on Google Search, YouTube, and their AdWords, so the kind of ads that are embedded around websites.
Commercial type of advertising.
So only political advertising. We still saw them getting through though, because if you like, people could pretend that they were educational or that they were commercial, and it's very difficult for kind of like. It's very difficult to do, right? The control that they have over the ad network is actually relatively limited. Okay. So one example is the day before the vote, The Guardian, which is a left-wing, I think editorially pro-choice newspaper in the UK, was on their website. It was showing to Irish readers a kind of a pro-life ad, and they banned political ads on their website, and also they weren't supposed to be happening. And so I notified them, and they told me that they ended up spending the kind of their morning meeting trying to figure out how this ad had ended up on their website. They were talking to the ad company who pays them. They were talking to Google. Like, nobody could figure out even how this ad got there, because like, I think there's just such little control over the system, and it's not set up in such a way that you can actually even take decisions about the way that it works. And like, why this matters is because this is financial flows in an election, right? And we govern that. Like, I think most countries have some rules around where money comes from, how much money is spent, how it's spent in elections, and like, we can't even begin. It almost reminds me of where we were with sort of money laundering things like a very long time ago.
Okay, thanks so much. Before I use my second question, is there anyone who would like to ask something from the audience? Yes, okay.
It's actually not about Ireland, but just to understand how it would work in Latvian context. Would it be possible that the same thing happens in Latvia, in the sense that we have very big diaspora outside, right? And let's say I support a political party while being, let's say, living in Ireland and Sweden, right? Could I place an ad targeted Latvian audience, and is it something that our legislation and that would technically be, I mean, technically it's possible, right? How we would see it here. So it's not about Ireland, it's actually more local affairs.
Okay, let me rephrase it as a question to Liz. Is there any controversy still left following this referendum? And I know that you just recently had another referendum on the choice of social media to prohibit either certain kinds of advertisements, for example, those from abroad, like diaspora, or prohibit political advertising at all. Is it still under discussion? Is being discussed in Ireland?
Oh, yes.
Such choices.
Yes. So, I mean, I think especially because in a way it was a bit of an embarrassment for kind of global companies to have to take these steps, in part because our law was so incomplete. And like actually our government, led by our Prime Minister, are going through, I think, a really positive process of trying to fill in the gaps in that legislation. I mean, this referendum itself is still controversial. It has been for 30 years. It will be for 30 more years. I think, I think every country has, just to your point, I think every country has its own dynamics. What we're seeing is, like, to my mind, what we're seeing is, like, we all have our political dynamics and we have our electoral rules and laws and norms. And then kind of like superimposed on that, we now have a domain which is completely ungovernable, where financial and information flows can happen in a way that are hidden, in ways that, you know, that we can't trace, and that we can't even analyze or see or begin to sort of question. And so, I mean, like, it is completely technically possible. If I wanted to, sitting in my house in Dublin, could within about 10 minutes target people in Latvia with political advertising, spending any amount of money that I want, and I could do that, and I don't have to say who I am, where I am. The people seeing that ad can know nothing, absolutely nothing about me. But I mean, how do you even begin with domestic legislation to deal with that? Because that transaction is taking place between an Irish citizen and a US company, right? And I mean, like, you know, we, in a way, we're lucky because Facebook are based, they have a big base in Dublin, and so they, you know, they were keen to not mess up. They have a lot of Irish staff. Same with Google, they were keen to not mess up, and so we were kind of in constant contact with them. But I mean, we've been contacted by groups, I think, especially in smaller countries, who are saying, like, do you have an email for Facebook? Like, you know, how do we even begin to sort of to contact and get in touch with these companies? Like, it's such a strange domain. Like, you know, I don't even know how we begin to sort of regulate for it. I don't know, that's very negative, isn't it?
Okay, it's as it is. It's realistic. We have just two questions. Let's take them both of them, and then we'll proceed.
I'm Charles Krill from the House of Commons in the UK. Hi. I've seen some evidence of which some are reading as coalitions of right-wing American Christian organizations banding their money together and funneling it through particular ad placement networks. And I'm wondering if you've seen any evidence of that in this referendum, and if there were any particular ad placement networks that stood out to you.
Thank you. My name is Lalita Chiga, and I've been a member of parliament, also working closely with campaign finance and campaign conduct regulation. I noticed two very interesting ideas in your presentations. First one was by our Swedish representative, Peter. You were mentioning that you feel that your election is good and has a high level of integrity because you are manual and paper-based. We had a citizens' petition a few years ago in our parliament for switching to internet voting. And actually some dinosaurs like myself and others were really hated by the citizens when we said that we don't think it's a good idea. And the second idea that was mentioned by Liz was that you felt previously happy about your framework for campaigns because you had a ban on paid TV advertising. We also achieved that, and we are extremely proud of it. And so we never introduced internet or electronic voting. So we are proud of these two things. Given this and the general caution about the electronic and internet technologies and so on and so forth. So we really have moved from really thinking that it's a panacea now to being quite cautious. Do you see that certain aspects of social network engagement in the campaign could be banned? From your perspective, should it be a perspective or the direction where we should probably consider moving?
Okay, just short responses.
To your first question, I would love to know. I mean, I have an inbox full of screen grabs I can share with you. If you can help me figure it out, I would love that. Yeah. I think on the TV ban, to me what matters about that is like a fundamental value that we have in our democracies, which is that no group should be able to monopolize the conversation by having more money than everybody else. And like it's to me, it's like, how do we think about those values and then apply them to other domains that have come up? Because I mean, like I don't believe that we should be in we should be banning behavior, because once we do that, then who else gets to ban behavior? I think it sets a dangerous precedent. What I think we should be banning is the ability to is the right to secrecy when you are paying money in order to try and influence democratic processes, whether that's in the immediacy of the election vote or actually, frankly, when it comes to sort of these topical issues. Like, people have the right to free speech. I think people at times have the right to sort of free anonymous speech, especially in contexts where that's a dangerous thing to do. There's a difference between that and the right to total secrecy about where information and money is coming from. And if you want to ban something, to me, that's the thing, like the untraceability.
Okay, Liz, I think that we will still touch this issue during the last panel after the break, which will be led by Inga on need for transnational solutions, which might also include some kind of bans on advertisement. But let us move even further back in time to Germany 1.5 years ago. And Martin, it would be great if you could give us some impressions about what went on during that campaign and whether there were some moments that seemed to be suspicious in context of that specific country in that specific time.
Thank you, Iveta. And I'm from one of those paper and pencil countries, I would have said. It's pretty much the same. I want to start out with two observations. One is that there was a high level of awareness of the problem in 2015 because there was a hacking attack on the German Parliament, the Bundestag, allegedly by Russian forces. So there was a high level of public awareness that this might be a problem for the election. In the end, it turned out to be that there was no attack on integrity for the German election in 2017, and some people were almost a little disappointed and said, well, maybe we're not that important for the Russians. They leave us alone. That was funny. Second impression is, if I talk to students in seminars, and we talk about social media, sometimes I ask them about Facebook, and they look at each other and wait a little while, and then they say, I think I've heard about this. It's something that my grandparents use, isn't it? So that's really off the radar for most young people, and that leads me to my kind of main thesis that I think we're talking about a very overestimated problem in terms of politics and decision-making for elections, because I don't really see how the mechanism is between kind of reaching people and influencing people. That's a completely different story, and maybe that's my political scientist look at it, that I don't necessarily buy that we have a new quality of political decision-making in terms of taking a decision on what we actually vote for. How do I come to this thesis? If we talk about election integrity, I think there are different aspects we need to tackle when we look at the election cycle in general. It starts with the election laws and the electoral system. It goes to voter registration, party registration. It goes all the way to vote counting and so on and so forth. And also about complaints about the electoral results that are finally published. And of course, there are always certain dangers to integrity in all of those different steps of the election cycle. And if we want to group them, maybe there are kind of 4 different groups that I would highlight that we can distinguish from each other. The first would be kind of technical issues, which would be safe or unsafe election machines that are not used, just like in Sweden. It's the paper pencil thing we still have. It goes all the way of wrong vote counting and so on. That's mainly technical issues. Then we have political issues, of course, important. That's about campaign financing, party financing, and so on and so forth. And of course, that is very important to the integrity of elections. And of course, it can be endangered in certain respects, because of course, there is a certain danger that if you're not capable of regulating the amount of money that is spent on election campaigns, that might have an influence. But I want to say it might have an influence. We don't really know. So even that needs a question mark. But I want to focus on the other 2 groups, which is kind of communication and also perception. And I think one of the reasons maybe why we're having this conference here today is that we have a different level of problem perception. And I'm a little in doubt whether we are actually highlighting a relevant aspect or whether we are just kind of playing the perception and misperception game. Let me come back to this maybe later on. In terms of communication and the German case, I think the most interesting thing, and as I think this has been highlighted so far, that we are talking about a social media phenomenon. And for the German case, that is not that important. Because public radio and public television still has a very high proportion of viewers and listeners. And of course, people have their Facebook accounts and they use Twitter and Instagram and so on, but it doesn't really make much of a difference in terms of taking, deciding on who to vote for. Every study for the German case we know so far suggests that it would be overrating the influence of social media, because interpersonal communications is so much more important than is media communication, and social media communication doesn't reach anyone. And there are some studies that suggest that even if people kind of pass on certain posts and like things on Facebook, they like things and send it on without even reading it before. Not even 5% of the people clicking the like button haven't even read what was written. So why should they take any of these things actually serious? I would doubt that. I think, but still, and that kind of leads to the second group of things, perception. It does have something to do with communication, and I think that's very special about the 2017 election, because there is a certain reason why we have this high perception of the danger of election interference. And I think it has to do something with this new populist and right party that we had coming into parliament in 2017, a party which called itself the Alternative for Germany. They started with an anti-Euro campaign 2012, 2013, but kind of slightly moved further and further to the right spectrum as an anti-migration party. And I think this new awareness of the problem of interference in elections does have something to do with this party. But it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the positioning of the party or the decision of voters to actually vote for them, but it's it happens by chance. Why is that? Because it's our first social media party. That makes the difference, and I think that raises the level of media communication and media coverage on this new phenomenon, because all the other parties are kind of stuck in the paper-pencil universe. They have their party organization that is based on local groups and so on and so forth. The AfD doesn't have anything like this. They could build a party from scratch, and if you build a party from scratch in 2015, you use social media. You don't have to add this to your existing structures of your party, but you start out with the things you have. And if you don't have any members, which is especially important in a federal state like Germany, where you don't have only a national election, but you have federal elections all the time. You need candidates all over the place. You have election campaigns running all through the year. you use the resources you have, and the AFD used these resources by using Facebook groups and so on and so forth, and this raised the level of awareness in terms of, you know, the dangers that are there in terms of interfering. However, no one was really, I mean, at least not according to the things I know about the German elections, no one was really pushed towards voting for this party because there was anyone talked into this by outside forces or something. I think we can explain the rising of this new party without any matter of election interference whatsoever. I think the second explanation is that journalists are much more aware of these new media, and Twitter, for example, is a pure journalism phenomenon in Germany. It's mainly used by journalists. No normal person would use Twitter. Still doesn't. But still, if journalists kind of keep receiving tweets from others, they just think that's real life. But it isn't. Okay? And I think that in a way, this perception problem goes back to this kind of journalist bias towards social media and the high level of awareness. And kind of combined with other aspects that we can maybe touch upon in the discussion, I think comes back to the point that reaching people and, you know, raising the numbers of people you reach by social media doesn't say anything about the effects this has for voting behavior. Because, as I said, interpersonal communication has been the most or the best explaining factor for voting behavior, even though we've had mass media campaigns for the past 50 years. It doesn't make much of a difference from a political science perspective. If you want to influence people to vote for someone or to vote or not to vote for someone, you have to sit with people, you know, at a table for lunch or supper and talk to your friends. And I don't really buy the argument that this should be any different in social media times. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much for quite provocative statements, which we should discuss right now. I just wanted to ask whether those trends that we are seeing right now in Latvia are the same in other countries, especially Germany, or not? Because the issue that you raised, whether we are trying to solve the real problem, is of relevance to everyone. Have you, in case of Germany, would you also see the trend of a certain generation of voters, especially those that are younger than 30, moving away from traditional media, from newspapers, television, radio, into internet? And if this trend exists, don't you think that there is something about social media that we need to consider, such that did not really exist 10 or 20 years ago?
Yeah, we do see this trend. If you look at people 35 and younger, we have the same trend. But in terms of voting or election campaigns, they are irrelevant because the group is too small. We have the oldest electorate ever at a national election in 2017, so the normal voter is 65 and older, and they're on Facebook. You know, that's the grandparent generation. So in a way, if you want to win an election, you don't address anyone who's 30 or younger, because they don't necessarily vote. Only about 35 to 40% of voters younger than 30 actually you know, cast a vote. If you want to win an election, you need the group of between 55 and 70. And maybe that means it could change. You know, we're talking about a social phenomenon, so I'm not talking about the future or anything. I'm, you know, talking about the election 2017. I don't know what it's going to be like in 2042. It's probably going to be different. But even if you, that's why I mentioned kind of students, because that's a kind of as a relevant group you can talk to in seminars. You find out about their political information behavior. Even if they use social media, they still look to kind of classic media and their social media outlets. They don't necessarily, well, they consume other media, but they don't take it seriously.
Let's compare one more parameter so that we are sure that we are on the same page here. In case of Latvia, if we look at our recent elections, the second most popular political party, KPVLV, according to our opinion survey, post-election opinion survey, almost only young people voted for them. Almost no one above age 60, very few people, but in the age group 18 to 24, 1/3 of all population, and they were extremely effective on Facebook. When you are looking at this AfD party in Germany, do you know the age structure of their voters?
Yeah, kind of the problematic group is men between 35 and 55.
Okay, so it's a bit different.
They're very attached to kind of populist parties. So women are out of this, so they're not part of the problem as usual. So it's a male problem, and it's like the two of us.
Okay, on that note, let's turn to audience. Any questions, considerations, and also panelists, other panelists can also engage. Yes, Elizabeth.
Something which I have missed already in the morning, because if we are discussing about social media and about the parties in social medias, one of the things which hasn't been discussed yet is the financing of those of the parties at all, because we do know, for example, that the AfD has some money from some places we don't know, or even we consider that we know where it comes from, but it's not there's not a transparency in that. So I think these things are much more dangerous for us at the moment in Germany than to see the social media. And I have to say that's right, because people who are taking media, they go to Spiegel, Focus, or newspapers, from the other things. In former times we ordered those papers, and today people are signing up on the internet pages. So.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. And I wanted to ask representatives from Sweden and also Ireland, but also here in the audience we have people representing Ukraine and Lithuania and Estonia. When you consider the latest either election or referendum event, would you say that a majority of important things happened online, some large part of important events happened online, or relatively little happened online? In case of Latvia, it seems, according to our opinion survey, that social media is on the rise, but still political debates and interpersonal contact advice that Martin mentioned is also still the dominant forms of getting election information for our voters. Is it the same in your countries, or is it different?
Well, in the Swedish election, we had a very small party that had a great impact in social media. They were called Alternativ för Sverige. We usually call them Alternativ för Sweden, because the same kind of party. And they received only a few votes, but they had a great impact in social media. So one shouldn't overestimate what happens on social media, because discussions between people when people meet are much, much stronger in how people vote and how people decide. So I'm trying not to overestimate the impact in social media.
Okay, yeah.
I think in Ireland, which is still a paper and pen country as well, it's really fun to actually, because we have multi-member districts, it takes us about a day and a half of sitting in the, it's super fun. It's like horse racing, because like one candidate will get eliminated and the votes get redistributed, and we all get very involved. But because of that, actually, I mean, you only need about 8,000 votes in Ireland to get into Parliament. And anybody who's done that will tell you that means you have to knock on 8,000 doors, and we still have a very kind of like door-knocking political culture. And when I was doing this project and I was sitting at my kitchen table with my hood up on the internet, like the world I saw was like a dark and angry place. And friends of mine who were canvassing, who were knocking on doors, were just they lived in a different world to the one that I lived on, and I found that reassuring, but also just really interesting. But actually counter to that, you know, especially in the early stages of the campaign, what we saw with a lot of small political advertising was that it was enabling offline organizing and campaigning. So we saw a lot of local groups, you know, targeting people in the local area, saying, you know, come to the community hall, to the church hall, and we're having a meeting, and then that's how they organize and found canvassers and things. So I think it's quite a complex relationship. I'd probably agree with what a lot of what Martin said about perhaps we overestimate some of the impact of this. But I think why it's relevant is that we can't see it. And I think, you know, when we're trying to estimate the impact of it, it's very difficult to do that when we don't even know how much of it is going on. And I think it's for people who it's a way for people who have money or who have technical skills to make it look like their views are much more broadly held. You know, you can get, we saw some videos that had, you know, 1.2 or 2 million views online. And if you see that, you think, oh, this is popular, oh, this is, but like you can't tell that a lot of those views were paid for. Well, I think it's really quite complex, the kind of the interaction between the two. And in the exit polls, so the kind of the survey when people were leaving the polling stations, people said 2% of people said that social media ads influence their vote. But I think nearly a third, so 1 in every 3, said that the personal stories of people was something that had impacted their vote. And that was the basis of a lot of the social media campaigns, you know. So, like, people might not think, you know, that they've been influenced by social media content, but like they'll remember the story. They'll remember like the woman's story, whatever way that was, you know, as a piece of interaction, even though it was sort of facilitated by this other thing. So I think it's really complicated.
Okay, that definitely.
Maybe I can just add one argument in terms of you know, giving us an instrument to actually to compare, because if you look at the German case, the you know, degree of volatility that is in there in the electorate is very different in different spots of the country. And if you want to compare it to Latvia, for example, maybe the eastern part of Germany is more like Latvia with a higher amount of volatility, which is people haven't, you know, had 60 years to grow up with a certain party system and getting attached to certain parties, but they tend to switch more often and more quickly than people would in the West. So we have a kind of east-west split, which is interesting. But if you want to compare it, there's a different mechanism still, because I would argue that this volatility doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the amount of social media input that is given to voters, persuading them to vote for someone else. Now they are just more likely to switch and change their mind anyway, no matter what kind of communication outlet there is. But if you look at the American case, for example, I think it's a completely different mechanism, because volatility is very low in the US, and it's kind of decreasing all the time, because if you vote Republican, you're not even thinking about the possibility that someone else might be voting Democratic. Okay, they're crazy. And the number of independents is kind of decreasing. So in that sense, you know, the higher amount of social media communication gives you the chance to stick to your own opinion, and it kind of stresses the point that you're on the right side of the aisle anyway. And that's a completely different mechanism in countries where you have a higher volatility and a party system that is very different to the American party system. So I think it makes sense to introduce kind of these categories to compare countries and show where there is no comparison possible.
That's very true. That when Liz was talking about people going to her home or elsewhere in Ireland, I thought that we are sorely missing this this kind of campaigning. In case of Latvia, only 7% of our voters said that they have met somebody campaigning. So that's definitely different. And what you mentioned is also definitely true. That in case of Latvia, it's even for Latvia, the volatility during these elections were extreme, and of course it's very hard to compare with more stable political systems. We have time for last question, if there is. Yes, okay.
Thank you. I'd just like to challenge the notion a little bit about social media not making that much of a difference, because, as you've rightly said, different demographics end up having completely different effects. For example, Twitter is over-indexed for journalists, absolutely, but it's also over-indexed for African Americans. The riots in South London were started on the BlackBerry messaging network. So there are different networks that are used in different ways. Also, in swinging an election, sometimes it doesn't come down to the binary of whether you're voting to the left or to the right, but rather whether you go out and vote at all, or if you decide to stay home. Now, certainly from countering violent extremism and online campaigns, one of the things that I've learned, and some might disagree with, is it's very hard to get someone in the middle to change their position. But it's a lot easier to get someone who's out at the edge and take them and push them into action or push them into inaction. And I think this probably applies to elections and referenda as well. I'm just wondering if y'all could talk about, address that a little bit in your experience.
And if possible, please try to be brave. And it's not necessary that all of you respond. So if somebody has some very relevant remarks. Martin, you started this conversation.
Sorry about that. Maybe the group of the non-voters for the German case. I can't talk about the other countries, but what we know about people who are non-voters in Germany, we know they are much less interested in politics in general. They have low income and low education level. So in a way, it's very difficult to actually mobilize them to participate in an election anyway. And if you look at the kind of the social influence on participating or instruments of participation, we see that the social dimension is smallest in terms of voting, because still voter turnout is still quite high. We had about 77% voter turnout. At the national level, it was up to 90% in the 70s and 80s, even up to 95. But on regional election level, you have voter turnout around 50%. On the local level, even lower. And we see that kind of the typical non-voter is not kind of the median voter, but it's a certain group. And it's very difficult for all parties, even for populist parties, to motivate this group of voters to actually go to the election. And this is why I mentioned the AfD before. They were not able to mobilize the non-voters, but a certain group of voters that used to vote all the time and maybe haven't voted the last election because they didn't find a party they wanted to vote for, but it's kind of not the traditional non-voter who was actually mobilized by this.
I think one sort of like other group that I don't hear about a lot is people who want to vote and will vote, but don't feel like they have anyone to vote for. And we had a presidential election back in October, and it was pretty much a one-horse race. The incumbent was winning by, I mean, in the end, I think he won 2/3 of the vote in a field of 7, because he's nice, and our president isn't that powerful. But it was also because I think the rest of the field were quite weak. And in the week before the election, one candidate made some controversial and derogatory remarks about a minority group. And he went from polling at about 3% to getting about 20% of the vote on the day. And there's been all sorts of interpretations of this and how much is this underlying, hatred in society for this group. But actually, so I was in the count centre with the paper, and because we rank, I saw a lot of people voting for that candidate number 1, and actually number 2, they went for the incumbent, who was a left-wing poet, right? And so I think, and when I see a lot of these results coming in, like I think especially that age group, people want to vote. Like I will always vote. I will find a way. I will find a way to vote. And sometimes I think it's just, and this is where maybe some of this media stuff matters. Like whose name have I heard of? Like whose face have I heard of? And I think that's an underexplored group. And I think we can sometimes put too much weight on that. And it's sort of the inverse of the people who are discouraged from voting altogether, who are maybe on the margins.
Okay, thank you, Liz, and we will. This conversation will continue after a short break on where we will touch under Inga's supervision and moderation on whether there is room for transnational solutions that could be common for many countries. But for now, let me thank a very patient and active audience, but most of all our panelists, which were all excellent today.